Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome everybody wherever you may be in the world. I'm here in my studio and I have with me Ben Heath from Grimshaw and Tom Powell from Type Studio. To set the scene for this lecture series, I need to let some people know that these RIBA National Award-winning projects are selected from the regional award winners. So each and every project from the 2021 award winners we will be presenting from now to the end of July are from an RIBA regional award and have been recognised through 2 tiers of rigorous assessment. So each project has 2 important awards. Being involved in the process of the RIBA award juries has been one of the most significant and meaningful aspects of my career, because studying, visiting and engaging with each project has been a learning experience. This learning experience is what we are keen to share. And what I hope you will recognise is not only the innovation, but also the careful thought and serious hard graft that goes into these projects, whatever their scale. The award criteria say that the project must be capable of stimulating, engaging and delighting its occupants, visitors and passers-by, have a robust vision that is reflected in all aspects of the design, with flexibility for the future, be environmentally and economically sustainable, provide social value, demonstrate innovation, invention, originality, architectural and conceptual ambition, as well as contributing generously to the public realm and to the surrounding community, while responding to the issues of accessibility and other social factors. So these projects are also judged on the complexity of their brief, the value to the client, and user satisfaction. We plan for the awards talks, Building Stories, to be both online and in person. So we hope for live and recorded Sterling Shortlist project lectures at the RIBA and in the regions. Today's Building Stories talk features 2 projects from the Southwest that I was fortunate to visit last year. The Bath Schools of Art and Design and Outfarm near Totnes, each followed by a Q&A. These 2 projects involve retrofitting structures to give the buildings a new life, but they are of substantially different scales. The first becomes the Bath School of Art and Design, and the second a barn conversion. Interestingly, the first has the next generation of Grimshaw architects updating the 1979 design of Sir Nicholas Grimshaw, while the second has the architect creating a home for his parents. So both have emotional ties and complexity, but the clarity of vision was not affected but enhanced by these relationships. So without further ado, please can I present Ben Heath from Grimshaw to talk about the Bath Schools of Art and Design.
Hi, thank you, Joe, for the introduction. I will just share my screen. Hi there. Yes, as Joe said, I'm here to talk about the Bath Schools of Art and Design. And as I hope will become apparent, I've called it Changing with Grace, and that should become clear halfway through the presentation. So under the theme of building stories, this is kind of a 40-year Grimshaw love story. And it begins back in 1976 with the Herman Miller factory in Bath. And the project was won under a design competition by Farrell and Grimshaw. This is our founder, Grimshaw Architects founder, Nick Grimshaw, on the right there. But at the time, actually, he was working as Farrell and Grimshaw with Terry Farrell, as he started practice with, before Terry Farrell went off to found or to be one of the founders of postmodernism, and Nick went off to join the high-tech movement. But that's a completely different story. But the building was built to produce Herman Miller's new range of flexible office furniture called Action Plan, and that very much informed the building design. But it was a meeting of minds between Max Dupree, the CEO of Herman Miller, and our founder Nicholas Grimshaw, and saying very similar kind of ideas and concept. Nick talking about buildings have to adapt to change, and Max coming up with this wonderful term about building an indeterminate building. It was located alongside the River Avon, and the building established a new agenda for a kind of humanizing of industrial buildings. And Nick referred to this as the democratic factory. It's worth in this image just noting those willow trees that Nick specified and planted. It goes to show why maybe architects shouldn't specify landscape, but there you go. And the building adopted a number of kind of innovations, in particular its approach to flexibility and the adaptive facade that it incorporated. So as the user's needs inevitably changed over time, this building skin could be shuffled between these solid and glazing panels in support of these changing uses. And the image here is a photo from the cover of the RIBA Journal in 1977, illustrating that even wearing extreme flared jean trousers, you could change out these panels in under 10 minutes. And here's Nick inspecting these GRC or GRP panels on site. And another key feature, longer term, the building was imagined as what Nick called a super room. And this is an illustration from the Architectural Record article from 1978, showing remarkable foresight from Nick, where he talked about, in the future, it may be a factory now, but in the future, it might even adapt into an entirely new use from which it was originally conceived. And these sketches there are the sketches that he kind of produced for the article, showing that, maybe introduce some courtyards and it could be an office building. So some of the other key features of the original building, this democratic factory, this idea of a focus on access to external environments, views, daylight, the idea that just because it's a factory, it doesn't mean that it shouldn't consider the well-being and health of people and create quality environments. Similarly, plug and play coded services supported the ever-changing manufacturing. So kind of this adaptability and flexibility is at the heart of everything about it. Another aspect that was actually completely unique, I think, is the brief that was developed by Nick and Max Dupree from the outset for the project. They called it a statement of expectations. And rather than kind of endless list of fixed areas, it simply established a set of values to guide not just the design decisions, but actually the behaviors of everyone involved in the project. And on this page is the entirety of that brief. And as kind of Nick notes there, it's so short, it's practically a poem. And it was particularly rewarding, actually, that the same brief, this brief here, was adopted by a Bath University client, illustrating how, it's as relevant today as it was in the 1970s. And at the end of the project, it was turned into this book by the kind of seminal graphic designers Pentagram. So that's how the story begins. And then over 40 years later, and actually following the listing of the Herman Miller factory, we were appointed by Bath University to look at adapting the factory to accommodate their schools of art and design. And like many academic institutions, they'd grown organically over time, and the school was kind of spread out over 6 different facilities throughout Bath. So this represented a brilliant opportunity to bring them all under one roof and engender a spirit of kind of interdisciplinary collaboration and innovation, bring all these people together. However, this is a photo of how we found the building, and those willow trees have been busy in the intervening 40 years and kind of dominated pretty much the architectural aesthetic from the Avon view. Also, in contrast to the original intentions, the building had become a home to machines and not people's, with the workers kind of siloed in these fairly miserable and grim little shut off office spaces to the perimeter, such that the whole super room could be given over to the factory and to the machines. It also, following a period of kind of inoccupation and actually a bit of neglect, the building did represent a significant kind of heritage and renovation project. However, as kind of illustrated, this is a photo from shortly after the university bought the building. They had this kind of pop-up exhibition in the space, and it just demonstrates that actually the bones and the DNA of the building, really remained intact. So what I'm going to talk through now are just a series of the key design moves we made, because I think when you're working with a existing building, but also a building which has just great kind of integrity, it's about identifying the right key moves and kind of building on the principles and values of the existing building, existing structure. So I'll just go through some of the key moves that we made, which were very much in support of the original building ethos and principles. So the first one is called repairing the super room. So as I said before, the people have been kind of siloed away in these little boxes. So as shown in the kind of illustrations below. The first move was to introduce a kind of open mezzanine decks, opening the space back up into the heart of the building and putting people at the heart of the building again. So, visually connecting the spaces and the people back together, connecting those people and spaces back to nature outside, and just flooding those spaces with light and creating kind of visually uplifting environments for people to learn and work in. The other key aspect of repairing the super room, because often the secret to kind of flexible spaces is actually identifying and accepting what is inflexible. And so in support of a kind of open, connected, completely adaptable super room, what we did was the heavy workshops, so things like metalwork, casting, woodwork, were located centrally in what we called the heavy workshop box, and then lining either side of these and animating the surrounding spaces are the light workshops, so things more like printing, photography, paint, digital. And this was very much at the heart of the university's ethos, the School of Art and Design's ethos, which is putting making on show, so learning by seeing and doing by making, which is something that the Dean constantly repeated to us. And again, even these kind of workshop spaces are flexible workshops, so they're able to adapt to the specific workshop requirements, but also as course architecture changes, they can adapt and change. So even though it's the same spatial configuration, they can offer a number of different environments. And then spatial planning. Again, we just made some really simple kind of key moves. The first one is a new internal street. So on the left there, a new internal street connects the city side to the north, to the River Avon to the south. So, really lovely 2 front doors, a riverfront door and an urban front door. And then a simple kind of on the right, simple wrap of first floor studio space above, and then publicly accessed via the retained existing visitor entrance to the west. That's on the left of the street, and that promotes public access and collaboration. And then the building to the right, to the east, is serviced from the existing loading bay. So the area to the east of the street is more private, accommodating workshops and private studios, and to the west is more open and collaborative. So the street, as well as making its connections, defines the kind of nature and interstitial space of the building. So that's a view of that internal street. We're looking towards the river entrance and, connecting people and connecting place. And promoting learning and collaboration through visual connections throughout the building. One of the nice kind of fortuitous aspects was the east-west circulation routes, which were derived from the original manufacturing process lines. So they still have these kind of forklift pathway stickers still visible on the retained factory floor. So it's kind of, again, in terms of how the building functions and operates, learning from its industrial use and reimagining that as a place for people. So the other key move was what we call raising the roof. And this is a photo from the original design competition model from the 1970s. And this was important from our listing aspect, actually, because it clearly illustrates that it's this yellow skeletal structure, which is of heritage interest rather than the kind of metal roof that's on top of it, because removing that roof was fundamental to making the building work. So we, on the left is the original building, and on the right is our repurposed building. So we introduced a new mass timber or CLT roof, which is lifted on these 1.5 meter high structural virundils, and this allowed for additional structural capacity for high performing rooftop PVs, but also a service zone located above those heritage beams, and critically additional 1.5 meters of space at mezzanine level to support studio space, and then a continuous clerestory and north roof lights, ensuring natural daylight throughout the building. So yeah, flooded with light, efficient, flexible, and spatially generous. We had some height considerations, so we couldn't actually have sawtooth north lights. So we used a kind of an interlayer, which blocks out everything but north light. So again, throughout the building, which was important in the School of Art, or one that accommodates art, north light evenly distributed throughout. Another one was plug and play, flexible systems. So following the same principles, the original factory building, a plug and play high-level service route run throughout the building, allowing for data power to be introduced throughout the mezzanine studios in line with any changes of use or accommodation. And what we did is we used this really useful grid of the 1.2 meters of the heritage structure as a framework for a flexible fit out within the mezzanine space. So with the studio space being completely tunable to specific needs and feature requirements. So anything from the left where it's completely open plan to the extreme where it's actually a fully enclosed unit. And actually what happens for the art studios, the students build their studio space in line with these grids at the start of the year. So yeah, lightweight, low carbon, high performing new roof, but retaining that heritage building aesthetic being clearly articulated throughout. So upgrading the facade. On the left is the original facade as we found it, which was a single glazed, non-toughened piece of glass and a very lightly insulated GRC panel. But what was critical, obviously, to the building is its flexibility. So the existing facade was upgraded, replacing the non-toughened single glazed panels with bespoke double glazed units and renovating the GRP panels. Yeah, but critically the same flexible and adaptable modular system was retained. But through the increased insulation, double glazed unit, etc., the environmental performance, total environmental performance of all aspects was improved by over 400%. And despite their age, a number of holes being drilled through them, 100% of the GRP panels were reused. So in addition to a new flexible modular panel system was introduced internally. So we also introduced the same idea of a flexible panel system internally that existed externally. Through the process of insulating. So whether it's an office space, studio space, you can swap out the internal panel in the same way you can the facade. So yeah, there's the external modular system, and on the left, upgraded, refurbished, and the internal modular system on the right there. So high performing facade system delivering the same aesthetic and adaptability as the original Herman Miller factory building. So changes with grace. The original Herman Miller building had been specifically designed to adapt and change to future needs, but where the existing building was unable to meet those new user requirements, we introduced a more kind of private, standalone rooftop pavilion. This was kind of critical to the university's brief and success because it created a kind of a more private, flexible, different kind of space with these amazing views over Bath. But it was, again, slightly fortuitous in terms of the original building in that it utilised these existing foundations that had been put in place where some kind of future new structure was actually imagined. So doing kind of more with less has become a bit of an imperative, both in terms of for universities, but also kind of responding to climate crisis that we see ourselves in. So the embodied carbon within this building, shouldn't be lost if at all possible. And on this project, we saved 1,420 tons of carbon. What's that? That's over 200 elephants. But I think what's really important about this project is what it illustrates is that this does not need to be at the cost of future flexibility or in compromising environmental performance. So you can have your kind of cake and eat it too. So that's a view of the drop-off of the visitor entrance. And as part of the project, the original removed facade reveals, were reinstated. So these little indents, which were removed, were reinstated to create this new riverside entrance. And then, so that's on the kind of detail of the project. Finally, I'm just going to touch on working with Bath Spa University, but also actually kind of working with universities in general, because despite fairly modest budgets, I do find that university projects that kind of tend to be incredibly rewarding, but also really rich projects. And I'll just kind of explore from my experience on this one why I think that is. So this is a kind of knowledge map. It's actually from a different university we work with, University of New South Wales. But what it maps is all their interconnected kind of network, basically. It's like the university network or brain. And whether it's students, alumni, staff, industry, other academic relationships, etc. And what it creates is this incredibly rich and diverse and deep and frankly expert network of people and kind of places. And from that, you can get some amazing kind of relationships and collaborations forming that really enrich the whole process. And so I've just got a few examples around the idea of fortuitous encounters. So we had a challenge on the project, which was we had this, it was actually a listed heritage structure. So in terms of fixing to it, we couldn't really drill through it. So there was, simple solutions where you could strap it, but it's not very attractive and also not very quick and flexible in line with the kind of ethos of the project. So we actually have an industrial design department, and we started this conversation with them because we had this problem. And actually, it turns out they were in discussions with a manufacturer who was thinking of similar ideas. And so from that kind of network, from this discussions emerged actually an entirely new product, which is this product called the Gecko, which is a magnetic fixing. So you can see here, it can be used for multiple things, but basically it's a magnet that just sticks to the structure or to steelwork. And within that, you can you adapt anything to do it, whether it's lighting, signage, clocks, whatever. Another key aspect of working with universities is, as well as being kind of experts, which is quite a delight, which means they also tend to respect you and the other consultants as being experts, which not all clients do. They're incredibly passionate people. So this is, we obviously go through an in-depth briefing process with all aspects of the university academia, but also technicians. And so we had our initial briefing workshop with the technician that runs the wood workshop, and we came back for the next one, and he'd obviously built this completely to scale replica of the kind of discussion we'd have at the previous meeting, obviously all in wood, but it's that kind of level of kind of passion that really helps bring great results. And then one aspect is also empowering students. This, for the project, we work with the undergraduates at the university, who actually developed this really lovely bespoke fonts and building signage system, which we ended up using throughout the building. There are other examples as well. We did some fabric acoustics with an artist who was alumni of the university, and other graphic work as well. So again, it's really enriching both, I think, for the university, the students, but particularly for the designers, I think, to work with. And then the final thing I'm just going to touch on, which is, they're unique organisations in many ways, remarkable and frustrating in equal measures. But we want to try and organise a time-lapse camera for the project, and we're told that, yeah, that sounds like a great idea, but we can't really afford it. But we pointed out, actually, what, they're 200 quid, surely, we could afford it on this project. But no, the budget was stretched. They could only do what they could do. But what they could do was provide an artist in residence. So Tim Viner, who was an alumni of theirs, internationally recognised illustrator. So while we didn't have a time-lapse camera, what we did have was an artist in residence who recorded the whole process we went through, whether that's the site hoardings that he sketched, but also just recording and sketching and illustrating the whole design process. So there you go. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Ben, that's great. I've got a couple of quick questions. Can you talk a little bit more about the cladding? I mean, it was 1970s yacht technology. So the real question is, was this the most difficult aspect of the upgrade to current standards?
We thought it would be, but actually it turned out not to be. Yeah, so it's exactly as you say. It's more, GLP is more common in architecture now, but at the time Nick had to go to some Cornwall boat builders to actually get this stuff made, to the point where we couldn't quite understand why it was made like it was made, but we copied it just in case for some of the new panels we had to make. And there was a lot of worry around what they call kind of fiberglass cancer or GRC cancer, but again, no delamination, amazing condition, and it turned out to be such a flexible material in that you can just patch it and repair it. And actually what was really nice is we did all the repairs within the building itself, so it was like an organism healing itself. We learned a lot. The contractor was very nervous about it, and in terms of committing to how many panels they'd need to replace, but actually in the end we salvaged them all. So it was we thought it'd be a lot more challenging than it was, and actually I think it just shows how kind of flexible and diverse the material is.
And I've got one other quick question. One is kind of vaguely how much of the original structure was kept in its entirety, but also focused on was there any hesitation from the Bath team, Bath University team, to not invest in retrofit rather than a new project?
If I'm honest, my worry is actually if it hadn't been listed, they might not have gone down this route. I mean, it turned out to be, in terms of cost per square meter, I think we benchmark it up to half the price of other similar institutions. So I think the evidence is there, and there's just nervousness, and the fact that you can create the same, really up-to-date environmental performance, deliver incredible accommodation and space that has a real integrity about it because of that heritage, but do it for less money. I think it's a great story to tell, because I think if it hadn't been listed, the route they might have taken would be actually it's easier just to build something from scratch.
I mean, my understanding is you kept 90% of the structure, but you built on top of it in order to expand where you needed additional roof lights and you needed height. So you didn't actually, the main structural frame is pretty much intact, isn't it?
No, it's all the structure and secondary structure was completely retained. So the fully primary structure frame, nothing removed, and the also frame,
Well, just think of all that saved carbon. And if you can sit tight, Ben, we're going to now introduce Tom for the next project. And as I said on various bits of social media, huge range of scales here. Tom Powell from Type Studio, I'm really delighted to introduce. I'm going to hand over to you, Tom, to present your very beautiful project.
Thank you very much indeed. So first of all, I just want to say thanks very much to the RIBA. This was the first time we've ever done anything like the RIBA Awards, and it's been a very positive experience. And a special thanks to Joe for coming all the way down to Devon, down winding lanes and finding us and coming to see our project. So very quickly about us, we're a small practice new on the scene. We are a practice of 4 equal partners. We're based in Hackney, and like a lot of kind of design-led London practices, we do a lot of sort of domestic extensions and refurbishments, sort of trying to focus on low energy retrofit. But we've also got this other kind of tranche of work in kind of barn conversions and new build homes kind of out in the countryside and particularly in sensitive rural contexts. But we're sort of trying to move from that into kind of multiple unit residential and some sort of more arts and cultural projects as well. So the Outfarm, or Red Hill Barn, came about, as Joe said, is a house for my mum and dad, so it's a very personal project for me. And when we were sort of looking to set up a practice shortly after we kind of completed our part 2s, we were sort of doing odd bits of work on the side, and discussions kind of came up with them about what they wanted to do, and this idea of them moving to Devon and building a new house and us working on that together as a project. And they wanted somewhere kind of out in the sticks that could, with a bit of land, that could become like an ecological smallholding effectively as a retirement project. And after years of searching, we found this site which has 23 acres of land, and it had a kind of barn sort of sat right in the middle of it, kind of totally roofless, no planning permission, no access, no services. And it was a kind of quite a crazy thing to undertake, but the kind of decision was that this was going to be the site for this project. And there you see the barn on the right, sort of sat in this kind of parcel of land. And in terms of their brief, we'd originally talked about finding a site and building them a much smaller house, but having found this building, it is kind of the size it is. So they had a very simple and modest brief for basically a 2-bedroom house with sort of flexibility to kind of have people to stay. But it's a very simple brief, and that gave us the sort of flexibility to work, within this kind of shell and to look more at the kind of conservation of the overall building. But I think a big part of the brief for them was not to change or ruin the character of this thing, because having found it, this kind of relic of an agricultural landscape, we all realised that the kind of building was kind of a very important and key part of the project. Also, because it's a big building and it was more than we kind of ever planned to take on, we had a very tight budget, and the location meant that a lot of our budget was going to go into services and access. So that kind of set the whole project to be about being sparing and very thoughtful in what we could do. So this is the building as we found it, and it really was a stone shell, you know, but the principal thing was that the kind of walls and the elevations were intact. And originally this would have been a 2-floored building with a large threshing barn for grain on the upper floor, and then a cow byre on the ground floor, which would have been for cattle. And you can see that on the bottom left image, the elevations are kind of very grand and kind of very beautifully set out. And the archaeologist who kind of did the historic building surveying of this project thought that this was probably a show barn, and actually it was commissioned by a wealthy landowner in that early industrialization of farming, as a kind of piece of sort of agricultural engineering of its day, almost kind of from a pattern book, as a kind of exemplar of how to farm at that time. So I mentioned this kind of tight budget, and you know, just based on the square meterage, we quickly realized the only way we could sort of achieve this and kind of get to the quality and the ambition of the project was to kind of get very hands-on with it, and to kind of take a self-build approach. But beyond that, we wanted to kind of learn from the process as kind of young architects sort of starting out with a practice. We kind of saw an opportunity to kind of take a more hands-on approach and get really involved in construction. So my partner Sarah, who's also an architect, and myself moved down to site. We lived in this yurt setup and kind of built a site office where we kind of detailed and drew other projects and kind of funded our way to kind of be here and working on the project. One of the first things we had to do was put in the services, so you can just see how far we had to get kind of electric and water. The sort of trench kind of went right down the valley and into the next fields. And this was our site hut that we built. So the whole team came down with partners, and we stayed in a cottage for a weekend on a very blustery, wet and windy weekend in, I think, March, and kind of built this kind of site hut, which stayed up for the full duration of the project and was basically our base to kind of cook, work, you know, draw, detail. But then kind of having that on site, this office, meant that we could, the way we did the project was kind of working with subcontractors, working with timber framers, masons, and we could kind of, you know, every detail was kind of talked through with the people that were going to do it. And we kind of had a very interactive process of drawing and discussion. But beyond that, Sarah, myself, and my father also were kind of very hands-on, and every day we would also do work on site. So, you know, as well as designing and coordinating, we were also doing some of the physical work ourselves, usually sort of slotting in where the kind of main areas were, you know, where sort of there wasn't an overlap with the different contractors. So then this brings us on to the design and our approach to, you know, how we actually undertook the approach to the building. And the key thing about that was that we wanted to be absolutely clear about you know, what was original and what was added. And that kind of clarity of old and new was the kind of dominant kind of guiding principle from a sort of landscape scale right down to the smallest details. So first of all, with the roof, that was completely gone, but we felt that the form of it, with these kind of half hips, you know, and this very kind of, you know, crisp, minimal, no roof light kind of aesthetic was kind of key to the quality of the building and the landscape. However, we didn't want to kind of put back the traditional slate roof. We wanted to show that something had happened and that this was a new thing. So this kind of milled aluminium corrugated sheeting is kind of, it references the agricultural, you know, it's almost what a farmer might do now to get this building back in use. But the kind of milled aluminium is a kind of space age material, and it has a reflectivity and a quality which is a kind of a bit special. And so there's a kind of a play on that there. The other kind of key landscape move was about the kind of curtilage and how we dealt with the garden and the domestic spaces. And we were absolutely adamant that the building shouldn't kind of spread out into the landscape, and that the agricultural and wild landscape should run right up to the building as it always would have been. So the garden's contained to this kind of semicircular fold yard that sits in front of the building, which once would have housed the livestock. And then at the rear of the building, the kind of field really runs right up. There's no garden or kind of paths or any domestication. You know, it really feels like it is in the middle of the open countryside. I spoke before about the elevations and how kind of very beautifully composed they were as this part of this pattern book. And this east elevation with the kind of little owl window at the top there is kind of very beautiful as it is. So one of the decisions we made very early on was that we weren't going to make any new openings or alter the kind of external walls beyond what was kind of left. And this kind of drove the design of the glazing and fenestration. So we set everything right back and tucked the frames kind of in behind the walls so that the amount of glass would be sort of maximized and bring as much daylight from these openings we did have as possible. And these doors on the ground floor were kind of, you know, built for cattle to go in and out. So they're very wide. It's a windy site. And yeah, a kind of conventional side hung door would be kind of forever sort of slamming in the wind and really cumbersome. So we came up with this idea of a pivot door, which would sort of balance and feather in the wind and deal with this oversized opening without kind of the additional fenestration of making a set of double doors or, you know, anything more complicated. So again, everything's designed to kind of maximize the amount of light we can bring in. And that's how that door works on the inside, you know, and there's a kind of really nice balance to them. They're kind of like, they translate this kind of opening that was made for cattle into something that's very usable. And there you see the amount of glass we achieve by kind of setting the frames back and tucking everything in. And actually, you know, it's a very glazed building, you know, from the openings we have. And then the next thing moving inside was the structure. And we basically took the same approach of this clarity between old and new. We decided that we wanted to echo the original spaces of the building, to work with those elevations and the openings that were there. So we reinstated the two floors and the roof kind of in broadly the same position as it would have been. We wanted to put these back as kind of clearly new and contemporary elements that would kind of contrast with our stone shell. And then you can see in the AXO how that works. So you've got yeah, a new timber roof truss structure and a new intermediate floor, which kind of creates the principal spaces of the building. One thing we noticed when we started to sort of draw through the building was that on the first floor, the height was enough to kind of give us two floors if you ever wanted to. And we were very aware that we're building a house for an elderly couple, and it's a big house. So we wanted to create something that was adaptable and you know, hopefully would find future uses, perhaps as a family house. So we didn't want to kind of constrain the space, and we realized that any kind of traditional A-frame truss would kind of bring a tie down quite low into that space, which would hinder that kind of adaptability. And the solution we came up with the structural engineers was basically to span the space the wrong way from gable to gable with this kind of truss structure. And that effectively is so efficient that it brings everything much higher up into the roof and allows for those two floors, but also kind of gives like a really impressive vaulted structure. The truss was quite an ambitious thing to make. It's very simple, but it's kind of, you know, this technology that's kind of outside of typical framers' language. So they pre-assembled the entire thing in these sheds before dismantling it again and bringing it to be assembled on site. And the result is this, you know, what's hopefully a very contemporary structure, but hopefully kind of echoes that kind of pragmatic minimalist sensibility that old barns have, and why we love the structures, because they're kind of doing you know, the most and spanning large spaces in an elegant way with as kind of little material as possible. So the sort of language of sort of doubled up members to use smaller diameter timber and using steel in tension where it's more efficient, it was kind of guiding this to create this structure. And there's the kind of finished effect with this very high vaulted space and pushing that structure up higher kind of really kind of creates a very impressive height. The other side of the structure was the first floor, which is a much simpler thing, and just post and beam, but it sits on these stone columns, which we felt was an essential part of the building to conserve. So the columns needed to stay load bearing, but they didn't have any foundations. And the structural engineer was sort of very keen that these things were kind of built in with a massive kind of concrete feet to sort of hold them in place. But that kind of ruined everything about the plan and the articulation of them. So we came up with this idea to basically create these welded steel plate shoes, which kind of bolt into the slab and hold fast to the base of each column. So then to the layout and program. Again, it's about doing as little as possible with the budget, so kind of creating as little division as possible just to kind of give us our spaces. So we employed this device of sort of boxes, which we inserted into the plan. So a box for a bathroom at the east end, and a box separating off the kitchen, which creates this sort of kitchen larder storage, divides the ground floor into 3 spaces. The kind of kitchen, the clients were adamant would sort of stay on ground floor because they wanted to have south-facing access to the kitchen garden, and then the kind of this flexible bedroom space in the center of the plan, and the principal bedroom at the east end. And then on first floor, again, just using this device of 2 simple boxes placed in the plan, which sort of bookends the sort of central living space, a kind of special event dining space, and then at the end on the west side, a kind of study homeworking area, which becomes another sleeping space when we're sort of there as family. And this image sort of shows how those boxes work. So they're kind of articulated to kind of set back from the columns and float under the ceiling. So they confess that they're non-structural and allow the whole volume and the original kind of free spanning structure to kind of read and stay legible. So this is the central living space, and on the right there you can see where the old cart door was. That becomes a huge kind of glass north-facing opening, which sort of really floods that central space with light. So this kind of this clarity of diagram of what's the old walls, what's the new structure, and then these boxes which divide space are kind of carefully articulated in different materials, and it's a kind of diagram that we stick to very religiously. So the walls are kind of this white monolithic lime plaster, which helps the structure to breathe. The roof and first floor that are inserted timber structures are all in Douglas fir, the structural beams and the plywood ceilings and the floor. And then the boxes are in sycamore, which is chosen to be something hard wearing, and the kind of palest timber that we could use so that it kind of bounce the light back into the space. That's the study area at the end of the building and the master bedroom. And then this concept of materials is taken right through into the bathrooms. So where we've got kind of spaces within these boxes, the sycamore cladding is literally a box and lines the entire space inside. And the kitchen at the end. So one thing that came up out of this project with all the publicity and the House of the Year shortlisting was the EPC, and there was a kind of big kind of fuss in the media, in the AJ, about the EPCs of the shortlisted houses, and just to kind of discuss, I think it's a really interesting point and discussion, and I think it reflected slightly badly on this project because it had an EPC of D, and I think one thing to note about that is that it has a heat pump, and any project that is heating is run primarily by a heat pump is kind of heavily penalised under the EPC. And the second thing is that the EPC was done before the photovoltaics were installed, which are kind of going in this year. So that will kind of, I would imagine, bring it up to something more like a B if we ever got it tested. However, there were a couple of points and decisions we made, which I think are things for future projects which are really interesting. So, for instance, the front wall here, we decided not to insulate because we felt, from a conservation point of view, that the kind of the sense of that stone wall and how it read without any lining was really essential. and actually the sort of detailing of going around all the doors and openings would mean that it's never going to be the most efficient element anyway. So therefore we felt we could kind of make up for that with insulation elsewhere. And actually the kind of heat loss through a stone wall is kind of quite debatable. You know, this is south facing, so there's quite a huge thermal mass to it, and perhaps the heat loss calculation isn't quite as straightforward as its basic U value. So, you know, we kind of took a view there, but it's something that we're always wrestling with these old buildings and conservation. You know, what is the right sort of balance? And secondly, on the right there, we were always adamant that this kind of eave detail should be very agricultural, and it should just kind of drop over the wall as perhaps originally it would have done. And that kind of did slightly restrict the level of insulation we could put in the roof to kind of make that roof structure work. And, you know, if we'd been less fussy with that detail, we could have kind of put a huge amount of insulation up there. So, you know, these are the kind of balances and kind of decisions we made, and that we're always sort of wrestling with. Another big part of the project was the kind of wider site, you know, the ecology and how we treated the landscape. As much of this project was about the building, it was also about what we could do with this parcel of land. So we kind of, you know, we worked up this plan for how the landscape would develop as a sort of designed thing to kind of create a kind of ecological land management plan. And then you see how some of this is coming into effect. So this kind of wildlife corridor of kind of very wild and scrubby land that accompanies the track up as you enter the barn. And some of the kind of projects underway, including wildlife ponds, you know, replanting and laying the traditional hedges, and the planting of a traditional orchard to create different habitats. Some of the prizes and accolades that the buildings won, it's been a really interesting and fantastic experience for us. You know, it's the first time as a practice we've ever done anything like this. So, you know, the publicity that the project's generated and being part of the RIBA Awards and the House of the Year, you know, it's been very exciting and a steep learning curve for us. But out of that has come some really interesting things. So, you know, they always say, well, if you get in architecture, if you get one project, you can get the same project again. And this is something we've just started working on, and it's almost a carbon copy of the barn in terms of the state of it and what we've got to work with. But it's interesting, it's a much older barn. It sort of dates from the Tudor period. And this kind of, you know, this approach to conservation that we took with the barn has also triggered other interests. So we've been approached to work on this medieval hall house restoration.
Great, Tom. That's fantastic. Can you just tell me how difficult it was to get planning consent? There's a question in the chat, which is, was there a reliance on it serving the small holding as an agricultural use?
Not at all.
No ties on it.
No ties on it. So the principle of getting the planning was entirely on the conservation and persuading the planners that the building was significant enough to be worthy of conversion. And there's a sort of test there of, you know, no one would reuse this building for agriculture because the cost to restore it would be so vast that the only kind of consent that would sort of generate its preservation is probably a domestic consent, because residential is worth so much more. So that was the kind of premise and the reason. So when we made the case for the history of the building and what it could be again, and why it's a kind of important part of the sort of landscape character, they were very supportive, actually.
And in terms of the overall U values, did you get building control approval? I mean, on the overall modelling, where there are areas where you are insulated on the upper level and behind the boxes, but there are areas where you've done nothing to the external wall. Does the overall envelope modelling achieve U values to satisfy building control?
Yes, exactly. They do. So the overall values of each element are kind of high enough. So we kind of balance things off against each other to kind of achieve that. But they meet kind of part L for kind of conversions and reuse of buildings. So yes, they do. But I think that the kind of conversation is interesting because it's, you know, where is conservation important enough to mean we don't go beyond those kind of basic standards. And it's a difficult balance to call, and it's a kind of increasingly moral one, and it's one we're finding we wrestle with kind of these other conservation projects we're working on.
Yeah. So a couple quick questions. You've have an idea that this could have another story for a family house, but in its next 300 years of life, do you think it could have any other uses?
I mean, the key thing is that the timber free spanning roof and floor are kind of hugely made of Douglas fir, and they're free spanning. So all the boxes could be ripped out. All of the linings could come off again, and it could be anything. It could even be a barn again. I mean, the idea was that the superstructure of this timber was really solidly made, and we put the stone back together. And yeah, then what happens within that? Those are the important things. Everything else can change.
I know you're still in a bit of post-traumatic stress because this was a very hands-on project. But what was your favourite part and the least stressful part of having that hands-on approach to the project?
Goodness, good question. I mean, I think actually the joinery was really enjoyable because it's timber. It's actually something that someone with limited skills can do, and to kind of see the stud walls go up, to do that cladding, to kind of put together some of the kind of bits of storage and joinery, which is just sort of slicing up bits of plywood and sanding them and being kind of it's kind of like making big architectural models effectively, and that was very, very satisfying. But yeah, there were lots of little bits. I mean, we made all the stone sills for the window sills, and we kind of made little kind of casts for those and floated them all ourselves. So it was it's a really real process of making and kind of prototyping and just seeing what we could do and achieve.
Great. Well, I mean, I think Ben's going to come in, but while he comes back, both of you retain structures. I mean, the question from the chat is, on the barn, when you made the decision to retain the openings, how confident were you that there would be enough light?
So it's a very good question, and we initially weren't. We built a kind of 1:50 model, which we had in the site hut, and we put it outside the actual barn in exactly the same spot, and kind of watch what happened through the day. And that kind of convinced us that actually once we kind of lined the thing with white cardboard, so you sort of get a sense of how the light would bounce around, and it was through that physical model that we kind of had the confidence to do it. And
then Ben, getting light into your structure was one of the challenge from a factory roof to a light-filled art school, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was one of the fundamental shortfalls with the existing roof, and north light in particular. So we used this interlayer, so it was north light only. But yeah, that's architecture, space sculptured by light. But,
sculpted by light.
But what you can do, and in terms of, as kind of Tom says, kind of modelling, so you can actually look, throughout the year, throughout the day, and really start to analyse a real level of complexity and detail about the light within architectural environments.
Well, can I just thank you both? And we all are enjoying learning from each other. As I said, it's a great pleasure to be able to visit these buildings, and I'm really glad to be able to share that with all our members and anyone else in the world who's interested in architecture. So these talks should happen weekly from now on, so please look out for them. Please join in and learn from all the RIBA architects. Thank you very much, everybody, including all my RIBA team who made this possible. Goodbye.